have a lot of questions from fans about anime work, which, of course, is a huge specialty of yours, of course, and some about other animation and video games and so on. But we're going to start off right in the crux of a listener question that we have, which I think will set the tone for this interview quite well. You've done a lot of work in anime, and you've done a lot of work in traditional animation. This listener wants to know what draws people to anime and keeps it going as an art style and keeps it going strong when there's so many other options out there and traditional animation keeps on improving and video games and so on. What draws people to anime and what draws voice actors like you to keep going back to anime?
Well, I guess we probably need to clarify that question, because when you say what draws people to anime, are you describing what draws fans to anime or what draws...
I think draws fans and then voice actors, probably because they're two different sides.
Yeah. Well, I can't really speak for fans in general. I'm sure the fans could express why they are attracted to anime. I can only talk about why I was attracted to anime before I became a voice actor. I was attracted to anime mostly because of the storytelling. I found that the storytelling in anime usually tended to be a little more mature, a little more sophisticated, a little more emotionally nuanced than a lot of the stuff that I was growing up with in American animation. And I liked American animation, but, you know, I grew up probably on a bunch of different Japanese animated shows, Speed Racer, Star Blazers, Battle of the Planets, and Voltron, and eventually Robotech. Robotech was the one that really sort of cemented in my mind. And Robotech was the first show that I saw that I understood that it came from Japan. Before then, I didn't have an idea that animation came from different countries. So it wasn't until Robotech came along that I thought, oh, wait a minute, this comes from a different country. And Robotech was a very sophisticated show because it was aimed at an older audience, because it was originally designed to sell model kits rather than little toys. And because the audience for model kits was older, they could afford to make the storytelling more mature. And so that was always very appealing to me. So I don't know how other people might enjoy anime, but for me it's always been the ability to tell any story they wanted to, no matter how mature or how emotionally nuanced they can tell it in Japanese animation. In American animation, we're often limited to either children's fare, stuff that is, quote, safe for children, or stuff that is sort of more raunchy satire for adults, like South Park or something like that. But there isn't a whole lot of middle ground. There isn't a whole lot of just straightforward dramatic storytelling or romantic storytelling in a lot of American animation, whereas there's a whole bunch of that in anime. In terms of voice acting, there aren't actually that many voice actors, I think, that are that attracted to anime. For one reason, it's very difficult to do. Doing this whole matching the lip flap of characters on the screen, well, that's common in Japan. That's rare here in America. That's not usually how animation gets done in America. So voice actors and actors in general in America are not always used to having to match the lip flap of characters on the screen, what's called ADR, or automatic dialogue replacement. Many actors find it very restricting. The technical requirements are very high, and so they feel that it's very difficult for them to give a natural performance under such technical restrictions. It has never really bothered me that much. I've always been comfortable doing it, so I don't see it as a problem, but there are plenty of voice actors who are just not interested. Also, anime doesn't pay very well. It's funny that it's probably the most technically demanding type of voice acting out there, and yet it pays the least of about any other type of voiceover work there is to do. So if you're trying to make a living as a voice actor and pay your bills, you know, and keep a roof over your head, you need to do as much voiceover work as you can, and voiceover work in animation and video games and commercials usually pays much, much better than anything you can do in anime. So the pay rate is very low. So the people who do anime usually are either really committed to it artistically, the same way that sometimes actors do theater. Theater doesn't pay very well either, but sometimes they find it artistically satisfying, so they want to go back and work on theater. Or sometimes it's people who are sort of new to the industry. It's a way for them to get their foot in the door and to be able to work on projects when they don't have as much of a name for themselves. So that's usually what happens in the world of anime. For me, it's been an artistic it's artistically satisfying. I like being able to tell more mature stories. I like having an art form that is not limited in terms of its scope, in terms of the stories that it can tell. I think it's sort of ridiculous for an entire medium of expression like animation to be limited to only one or two genres, like children's animation or adult satire animation. I think that animation is a storytelling medium that can tell all sorts of stories. So I always feel a little more relaxed in the freedom of storytelling that happens in Japanese animation. And I'm always hoping that it will bleed more over into American animation, that American animation will also find the freedom to tell whatever story might come into someone's mind.
That's a fantastic answer. So one of your early anime projects is actually one of my favorite animes of all time, is Record of Lodoss War, Chronicles of Heroic Knight, the sequel remake-ish of the original series, which is, of course, Japanese Dungeons & Dragons, I guess we can call that one.
Well, actually, it's Japanese Lord of the Rings. I had the honor of being at a convention very early in my career with Ryo Mizuno, who was the writer for the original Record of Lodoss War. And he was a little nervous, didn't know anybody, but I took him out for drinks, and we started laughing about Tezuka and different other anime creators, and I got him to loosen up a little bit. After I had a couple of drinks on him, I said, okay, Mizuno-san, Lodoss. He says, hi. I said, what about Lord of the Rings? He goes, hi, 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 hi. And he looks at me and he says, Gim, who is the dwarf character in Record of Lodoss War? I said, yes. He said, Gimli, who is the dwarf character in Lord of the Rings. And I said, yes, I figured that one out. Now, how about the rest of the characters? Can we talk about them as well? So clearly, Mizuno-san was highly influenced by Lord of the Rings. And Dungeons & Dragons was highly influenced by Lord of the Rings. Dungeons & Dragons, when Gary Gygax and those guys were trying to put together Lord of the Rings, they couldn't use terms like Hobbit. They had to use terms like Halfling so as to avoid being sued by the Tolkien estate for infringing on Tolkien's copyright. Because the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit basically defined the genre of modern high fantasy literature, and so everyone sort of owes a debt to the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. In fact, even George R.R. Martin has said, the author of Game of Thrones and Songs of Ice and Fire and whatnot, he says, we're all walking in the footsteps of Bilbo Baggins, which is absolutely true. So yes, Chronicles of the Heroic Knight, the TV series, which was a sort of sequel to the original Record of Lodoss OVA series. The first couple episodes of Chronicles of the Heroic Knight, I believe, retold some of the last episodes of the Record of Lodoss War OVA, and sort of rewrote the story of Orson a little bit, if I remember correctly. But then from then on, it moved on to the sort of second generation of heroes with Spark, who is a character that I played. And a bunch of the other characters in the TV series. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And I know you're a big Tolkien fan. I've heard you talk about Tolkien. You mention it many times and when people discuss things with you. Is your fandom of Tolkien and fantasy one thing that draws you to, well, stuff like anime? Because in Japanese animation, they tend to hit those themes, tend to hit fantasy genres and hit those themes that they use in Tolkien, the more mature themes, versus, American animation, where if you have a fantasy show, it's, I don't know, like in the 80s, it was like Legend of Zelda thing and Dungeons & Dragons show. You don't have a lot of fantasy stuff in American shows, but in Japanese, they hit those long and hard. They keep on hitting them.
Well, I think we do have a history of fantasy storytelling and animation in America, especially most recently. I mean, what is Avatar and Legend of Korra but fantasy storytelling, right? I mean, it's hop, skipping, and jumping away from casting magic. The problem is that, and Nickelodeon has said this, that they can't actually say magic because they're worried about the reaction they might have from certain members of the religious right who think that any mention of magic is somehow related to the devil or Satanism in some sort of way. And some of your listeners may be familiar with the people who protest things like Harry Potter as, being worshiping the devil. It's all sort of silly. But we do have a history of fantasy storytelling in American animation. It's just that it's not always as there are no weapons. There are no edged weapons, shall we say. If you go back to the 80s and you look at the Dungeons & Dragons animation show that I watched as a kid, and I thought it was great, except that no one had a sword, which I always found really frustrating. No one could actually cut anything, which sort of, makes things a little difficult. At least in Star Wars, you can, cut people's arms off. You couldn't do that in animation at the same time period in the 80s. So that's a little frustrating. Whereas in Japanese animation, there's plenty of sword fighting. That's not a problem at all. And they can do it both in fantasy storytelling and in historical fiction, like Rurouni Kenshin, where they have samurai fighting with swords and whatnot. So, I mean, I'm a Tolkien fan. I'm also a Tolkien scholar. I study it because I am sort of obsessed with mythological storytelling and animation. Some of your listeners may be familiar with my work in mythology and storytelling. I actually have a website called Mythology and Meaning, which outlines much of my scholarship. I give presentations at academic conferences and film festivals and conventions about how the religious traditions of different countries affect pop culture storytelling. And if we're going to talk about storytelling that has deep mythological roots, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are way high up there on the list, you know, along with things like Frank Herbert's Dune and Star Wars and things of that nature. So I also just happen to be raised on Tolkien. My mother used to read me The Hobbit endlessly when I was young. I fell in love with the old Rankin Bass animated version of The Hobbit from the 70s. I was always very fond of that. So I was sort of steeped in Tolkien ever since I was a young kid. But I have an appreciation for Tolkien on a different level now that I've studied mythology and I've studied comparative religions, and I understand much more about what Tolkien was doing, both as a creator and as a scholar. He was the foremost scholar on Beowulf. He sort of set the tone for Beowulf scholarship back when he was the youngest chair of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, and wrote a very famous book called Beowulf and the Critics. Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, rather. And so he would be famous in scholarly circles just for his work on Beowulf, even if he had never written The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. But then to turn around and create such definitive creations in the world of fantasy is sort of amazing. And I think that's why we haven't had something of that authority since in fantasy, is because we don't have someone who is that accomplished a scholar as Tolkien was. So I study Tolkien, I study any great creator, because it helps me in my artistry, it helps me, give me control over my creative and storytelling abilities, and I think it's useful for others who want to expand their storytelling abilities.
So this leads into a listener question. They said, as a Tolkien fan, did you seek out roles in games such as Lord of the Rings Conquest, or did they just come to you and you were just happy to take them?
Both are sort of misconceptions about how acting works. It's very rare that an actor can sort of go out and get a role. I think I've only done it really once in my life when I just happen to have the opportunity to ask my agent to pursue Pixar and Disney character voices to try to get a role on Howl's Moving Castle. And they gave me the role of Turniphead, Prince Turnip, who was a smallish role, right? I mean, they had that role to fill, and they could tell that I was a capable voice actor and that I seemed appropriate for the role, so they cast me. But it's usually not how you get big roles. You know, you usually don't get cast as the lead of a character in something animated by pursuing them. Nor do they usually just come out of the sky and say, we want you to play this character. Usually what happens is that the producers have all these characters that they need to cast, and they submit these characters to agents, and then the agents have their actors audition for these characters, and we submit the auditions, and maybe we hear back, and most of the time we never hear back, because we audition far more than we ever book roles. But, you know, I've auditioned for things in the past, and one of the first things I worked on in the Lord of the Rings franchise, I played Haldir, and I played Faramir in some early Lord of the Rings game. I can't remember which one it was now. I also played, I think in the Battle for Middle-earth 2, which is a sort of real-time strategy game, I played the voice of the orc commander on the side of Mordor. So if you played the Mordor side, you had this voice telling you how to play the game, and it was me, and it was this really crazy over-the-top orc voice. But then I happened to audition for Disney character voices for the voice match for Orlando Bloom for Pirates of the Caribbean. And I actually got cast to play the voice of Will Turner from Pirates of the Caribbean in all the video games and other sort of related Pirates of the Caribbean projects. And when they figured out that I could do a good Orlando Bloom voice, I guess the Lord of the Rings people figured that out, and then they had me come in and start playing Legolas, Orlando Bloom's voice in Legolas in Lord of the Rings. But I wasn't originally cast as Legolas. They didn't come search me out until I happened to get booked at Disney first, and then they found out, oh, he sounds a lot like Legolas. Maybe we should cast him as that. And so since then, they now know, and they tend to call me up when they have to cast Legolas in a video game. But, as actors, we do our best to get auditions. We do our best to record those auditions. We perform, usually in our little home booth. We record auditions. We do our best. We do all this work. We send it out, and then we hope we get a bite. We hope someone says, yes, we would like to hire you for this project. And then we can either say yes or no. That's usually what our options. But it's very rare that a voice actor can sort of hunt someone down and say, I want to be in this project. Possible, but it's tricky, especially in the world of animation and video games, especially in video games, where things are so secretive. You have almost no idea what people are working on. So I've auditioned for projects, got cast in them, walked in, and found out it was a completely different project than I thought it was from the audition.
And so we actually got to interview last week one of your friends or people who worked with you quite a bit, Quentin Flynn, or Q, as he says he's referred to as.
Oh, is he's part of the Q continuum now? Is that what he's doing? Okay.
And he actually said to ask you about working together on Final Fantasy Advent Children, which is, of course, Squaresoft's second attempt at making an animated movie. The first one ended up being disastrous for them financially. So this is something we asked him. What was it like going into Final Fantasy Advent Children, a film that for Square really had to work or else they would probably never make movies again? And what was the feeling like being, you were Rude, I believe is what he's called.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be one of the fun henchmen who gets to do a lot of the silly stuff. What was that role like for you? And what was it like working opposite Quentin Flynn, who is the opposite member for you?
Well, I didn't work opposite Quentin Flynn. That's the thing about when we're working on anime, which basically that's what Final Fantasy Advent Children is. It's computer animation, but it was done in Japan, and we have to match the lip flap of the characters on the screen. So because we're having to do the lip flap matching, in America we tend to record that separately, whereas in Japan they tend to record it like a radio play with everybody at once. But in America we don't tend to do it that way. Everyone comes in and does their part separately. So while Q and I both worked on Advent Children, we both worked on it at separate times, and we didn't actually get to see each other in relation to that project until it was screening in Los Angeles when they had the big sort of premiere opening in Hollywood. They happened to get a big theater, and we all went down we were all invited to the screening in Hollywood, and that's when I finally got to sort of get nose to nose with Quentin and say, hey, how you doing? And then we started watching the film, and we realized that our two characters of Reno and Rude, who we knew were sort of a pair through the story, right? They spend most of the story together, that we're the comic relief. That there's all this serious stuff going on with Cloud and Tifa and everybody else. And then Rude and Reno show up, and everyone starts giggling and laughing because we're the comic relief in the film. And we love that, but we had no idea that was the case until we were actually at the screening watching it with all the fans. So we're not always as informed about what the situation is. I did not realize that Advent Children was a make-it-or-break-it project for the studio when we were recording it. I was just trying to do my best to play the character to the best of my ability. That's usually what I'm doing. So many times when people ask me, what was it like playing this character? And I say, well, it was sort of like voice acting. I was doing my best to play the character to the best of my ability. Now, the thing that is different maybe about the process of how we worked on something like Advent Children as opposed to the process on other anime or on other video games is that the people at Square are very particular about how they want the lines read. So there's a lot of we record something and then people talk about it a lot. And then we record something else and then people talk about it a lot. There's a lot of debating among the producers about whether that's the right direction or not. So the process can be a little slower when it comes to working on something from Square as opposed to working on other projects which might work at a faster clip. So that's the main difference in the process of working on the film. But as far as working on it as an anime, I did my best to play the character to the best of my ability based on the knowledge and experience that I had. And I didn't get to see how the whole project came together until it was time to watch it with everybody else.
Before we jump to Hellsing, which is a project which a lot of people really want to talk about, we're going to hit some fan questions really quick because these ones don't really fit, among other things. Listener Matt is a fan of God of War, and he wants to know What was it like inside your head, or how were you able to act through getting your head ripped off in God of War?
What was going on inside my head? Well, I was trying, honestly, to act to the best of my ability. I think that sometimes there is a little bit of a misconception from the fandom, because the fandom gets to watch these shows. And the fandom watch these shows, or they play these games, and they get to have this experience with these characters, right? And they relate to these characters, and they think, oh my gosh, it must be so cool to be that character. And there's a difference between actually being Helios, the sun god in God of War 3, and sort of playing Helios. It's sort of like, we're the chefs. We're trying to make a meal for the fans. I always use cooking as a metaphor for the whole acting process because there's a lot of parallels. So you guys are eating the meal, right? And you're going, oh, my God, this tastes so good, or oh, I love this dish, and isn't this wonderful? And then you say, so, chef, what was it like cooking this steak? Or what was it like making this soup? What was going through your head when you were making this soup or cooking this steak? And if you ask a chef, they're probably going to say, I was trying to cook to the best of my ability, right? I hope you enjoy it. Like, I hope you really enjoy the food. That's sort of my purpose in life, is to make food as good as possible so that you guys can enjoy it. So when I'm playing Helios, the sun god, and they say, okay, we've got to rip your head off, I'm thinking, okay, cool. I'll try to, make the sound of my head getting ripped off to the best of my ability. I need to make sure I don't blow my voice out, because we're probably going to have to do it more than once. At the time, they also had a camera on my face so they could get some reference for the animators. So I had to hold my head sort of still. I couldn't sort of throw my head around too much. So I had to keep my head still, and I'm screaming to the best of my ability. I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if I were getting my head ripped off, the kind of noises I would make. What would be the most satisfying kind of noises for the audience to hear? What would make it really satisfying for the audience? So you can see, in my mind, I'm thinking about all this stuff that I can do to make my performance as believable and as compelling as possible. I'm not thinking to myself, oh, I love being the sun god. Isn't this great? Because that's not, it's like asking a puppeteer what it's like to be the puppet. It's like, I'm doing my best to give you guys a good performance. That's really sort of my aim and what I'm doing. So was it fun working on God of War 3? Yeah, it was. It was a great project. There was some really cool stuff. I had a feeling I was going to die because my name wasn't Kratos. If you're working one of the God of War games and your name isn't Kratos, then you're probably going to die at some point, probably horribly. So it was just a question of when that horrible thing happened. And I thought my death was rather exciting, so I was pretty happy about that.
Okay, this one, next one's involved with your work with Pokemon, where you were a writer, or as we know, because we've talked with Jeff Nimoy quite a bit, this is more like a translator. We have to translate it to English and then make it work in English. With Pokemon, when you adapted it from Japanese into English, you did 3 episodes. Was it?
I did far more than 3 episodes, but is that what's listed?
IMDb says 3. Yeah.
Well, IMDb is not always accurate, so.
Well, when you were adapting from Japanese to English, when it came to Pokemon, was it easier to do a straight adaptation, or were there certain instructions that you guys had when you were changing it? Like, for example, Jeff Nimoy said with Digimon, they touched it up to make it more humorous and got rid of some of the Japan moments. Was there anything with Pokemon that you recall that you guys had to touch up to make it work with English audiences, or did it translate pretty well?
It did not translate so well. Mostly not because of anything about the show. Mostly because they were trying to package Pokemon as American as possible. Nowadays, I think people, especially anime fans, are very used to the idea that a licensing company is going to bring over a show and try to keep the characters and the characters' names and the story of this show as true to the original as possible. That's a very recent phenomenon in the history of anime being adapted into for American audiences. All the way since Astro Boy back in the late 60s, early 70s, and Gigantor and everything else, anime traditionally has been highly adapted. Robotech is the classic example of just totally rewriting parts of the story to try to make it more palatable for an American audience. That doesn't happen as much anymore. We call Naruto Naruto. We don't call him Ned, But if Naruto had come out 20 years ago, we might be trying to call him Ned, the same way that we didn't call him Satoshi, we called him Ash. Ash Ketchum, to try to Americanize it for the American audience, because they think it'll sell better that way. I'm one of those people who would rather keep the story as true to the original Japanese intention as possible. I have an affinity for Japanese culture. I like being able to see the storytelling from Japan as close to the original creator's intention as possible. And so there was a little bit of tension there when I was working on Pokemon, because I would want to keep it close to the original, and they would constantly tell me that I needed to punch it up. That was the term they would tell me all the time. Punch it up, punch it up. And there was one sort of crossroads on that show. There's an episode in the first season of Pokemon where we get to find out why Meowth can talk. He's this weird Pokemon who can actually speak words, and he walks on two legs. And so this episode was about the backstory of that. So you can go back and research that if you want. And in that episode, Ash and Brock and Misty get invited to Hollywood to see the Pokemon movie. And when they arrive in Hollywood, Hollywood is a ghost town. It's abandoned. And they all look at Brock and they say, Brock, why is Hollywood a ghost town? And Brock basically says, well, it's because of the recession. Well, that was a problem, because while at the time there was a recession in Japan, there wasn't a recession in America. So there was no good reason for Hollywood to be a ghost town, because America's economy at that time was doing quite well, thank you very much. So I had about 14 lip flaps, 14 syllables to try to explain why Hollywood was a ghost town. And so I said, well, Hollywood's a ghost town because everyone's at home watching Pokemon on TV and nobody goes to the movies anymore. And I thought that was kind of funny. I thought it was sort of tongue-in-cheek. The producers didn't quite care for that. They wanted something different. They accused me of using the original Japanese translation. I had to explain to them I didn't use the original Japanese translation. I was trying to adapt it. I'm not sure what direction we should go in. Maybe we should have a powwow and talk about, what direction this could go in and come up with some more ideas. And they decided that that was too much trouble, and they basically fired me. And I said, well, good. I'm tired of working on this anyway. This is sort of ridiculous. So I didn't have the best experience working with some of the producers on Pokemon, but it was enlightening to be able to work on the show and sort of see the process of everything. Pokemon, Digimon, these are shows that are usually licensed by much larger American companies that are trying to make them as palatable as possible to a younger audience. So they're usually not as concerned with keeping it true to the original Japanese intention. And that just sort of varies from show to show depending on what's getting produced.
So now we're going to go to Hellsing, because it is Halloween, and Hellsing, or Alucard, is your character, or Dracula backwards. You actually got to play him in both shows, the original, which the one I grew up with and loved, and then the Unlimited one, which was closer to the actual manga, because I believe in the original one, the manga wasn't done yet, and so you guys caught up and then passed it and had to create an ending. Since you've played this character more than anyone else, and you definitely know this character, what do you think draws writers and people to Alucard and to Hellsing in general to make people want to do a show about Dracula? That, we've had lots of stuff about Dracula, but what makes Hellsing itself special?
Well, I think you have to start by saying what makes vampires compelling to people. Vampires have been around and have been redone in all sorts of different ways through the decades, through the centuries, actually, right? If we go back to Bram Stoker, and if we go even before that with Polidori's vampire back in the Mary Shelley Frankenstein days. So the vampire is a compelling character, I think, because the vampire usually has to do with sort of taboo sexuality. Whatever is sort of a little bit beyond the pale in terms of what's thought of as appropriate sexuality for whatever society, that's where the vampire tends to live. What is and is not appropriate sexuality has expanded over time. So the stuff that was taboo a century ago is now considered totally acceptable and actually quite normal and not something that needs to be taboo. So the vampire has to keep changing his location in order to maintain his sort of dangerous area, because people like playing with that notion of sort of dangerous sexuality. It can be titillating and exciting. I think the innovation of something like Hellsing is that they decided to go to this very sort of BDSM place, right, where we've got a lot of sort of dominatrix, submissives and doms, and the relationship between submissives and doms, and all that kind of stuff, which at the time when Hellsing first came out, back when we were working on it in 2002, this was very new territory to be doing in sort of pop culture storytelling. No one was really talking that much about BDSM relationships, and certainly not in a vampire story with lots of sort of Quentin Tarantino-style gunfights being very sort of modern and edgy and whatnot. Well, now we have 50 Shades of Grey, right? It's like, what, almost 15 years later, and BDSM storytelling and sexuality is actually quite common in a lot of pop culture storytelling. So, like the rest of the world, the rest of the pop culture world sort of caught up with Hellsing and what is and is not sort of taboo or titillating sexuality. But I think that's why Hellsing was so compelling, is that it worked both on the sort of sexual titillation level, this sort of new territory where you could play with different fetishes and different relationships. And it also had this modern gun-toting sensibility, which I had never seen with vampires before. So it almost had, you can call it Quentin Tarantino or like John Woo's gun ballet types of films. It had that sort of sensibility, which added a very modern edge to the vampire lore. So I think that's probably why it was so compelling to so many people.
And so this is a listener question. When you were able to return to Hellsing Ultimate, was there anything that you were able to not necessarily fix with your character, but adjust, anything that you wanted to, say, improve that you were able to do the second time around doing that character?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. If you ask any actor who's worked in the theater for any length of time, they'll rehearse a show, they'll play a character, they'll even do the character on stage. They might do the character on stage for months and months, and then the show ends, and when the show ends, they think, oh, now I finally understand the character. If I had a chance to do it again, I feel like the actors would say, I feel like I could be so much more rooted in the character. It would be so much more, I would have marinated in the character so much more, it would come out of me so naturally. And very rarely do we as actors ever get the chance to go back and do that, to actually be able to play the character again. Well, that was the wonderful gift that was given to us with Hellsing Ultimate, is that we were actually able to go back and play our characters sort of again. Sort of, though, because the story was a little different. The premise of the show was basically the same, but the plot of the show was different from the original TV series. It did hew closer to the original manga. And the thing is that character is interrelated with plot, and plot is interrelated with character. Sometimes people want to separate the two, but you can't really, because characters have to push a plot forward to make it happen, and what you do in the plot reveals your character. So the two are sort of inseparable. So while I was coming back to play Alucard, quote, again, it was a different type of Alucard. I had to make sure that I was doing the Alucard that was in Hellsing Ultimate, and not just trying to repeat the Alucard that I did in the Hellsing original TV series. In the very first episode of Hellsing Ultimate, we get to see this whimsical side to Alucard, because he had just made Ceres a vampire, and Integra turns to Alucard and say, why did you do that? She never asks that question in the original TV series. She just says, it's time to go home. She's just sort of flustered and frustrated and says, enough of this. But in the OVA, in Hellsing Ultimate OVA, she asks Alucard straight out, why did you make her a vampire? And Alucard has to answer. And he says, I don't know. I guess it was just a sense of whimsy. So there's this whole new aspect to Alucard's personality that I need to make sure to play as believably and as compelling a way as possible. So that was always my focus, is to make sure that I was being as true to Alucard as I could in this new story, and that I was incorporating whatever was going on in the plot to make sure that his character was believable and compelling in this version of Hellsing as opposed to earlier versions.
So the character that you were able to do in Hellsing Ultimate and the character that we had in the first Hellsing, you said how they differ in plot. Did they differ noticeably in, say, personality and questions beyond just him having to question more of his actions and becoming more accountable in the Ultimate versus the original? Was there any personality differences that, well, either you liked or disliked, but that you were able to put into place that were challenging for you as the voice of the original one that you now had to put into play again for the second time?
Well, the new stuff that was revealed about Alucard's character in Hellsing Ultimate was basically dictated by the difference in the plot. So I alluded to the time when he talks about his whimsical nature, which isn't really explored that much in the original TV series. Another aspect of Alucard that we get to see in Hellsing Ultimate is we get to see him as Vlad the Impaler. We get to see him as Count Dracula in his original body with his crazy Transylvanian accent. We had never gotten to do that in the original TV series, and it was quite gratifying to be able to play him with the crazy Transylvanian accent and whatnot in his ancient armor, wielding a sword. It's always satisfying to be able to explore different aspects of the character. Was the overall agenda of Alucard changed, like his overall goal in life? No. He's got the same sort of goals in life, just like Integra had the same goals in both as the head of the Helsing organization in both the first TV series and in the OVA. So our overall agenda is about the same, just like Gandalf's overall agenda in The Hobbit and in Lord of the Rings is the same. Gandalf is the steward of Middle-earth. He's trying to take care of Middle-earth. In The Hobbit, he's doing it by trying to help these dwarves and help them defeat Smaug and get their gold back. In The Lord of the Rings, he's trying to help Middle-earth by making sure the ring gets destroyed and all that stuff. So we see different aspects of Gandalf's personality come out in The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings, but he's basically got the same agenda for both stories. It's similar for Alucard. He's got a similar agenda. He's there to serve Integra, his master. He's there to find someone interesting to play with. He's desperate for a good playmate, someone to give him a good fight. The people he fights in the original TV series are different sometimes from the people he fights in the Helsing Ultimate series. So because he gets to fight new and different people in Helsing Ultimate, new and different aspects of his personality get revealed. So is it fun to do that? Absolutely. It's fun to be able to flesh out a character with all sorts of details and bring them to life with as much sort of veracity and dimension as possible.
Okay, so we're going to do 3 listener questions to wrap this up. The first one is, in recent years, there's been this huge onslaught of superhero games, superhero shows, movies, and so on. Marvel and DC are having a heyday as far as all the different projects. And over the past half decade or so, you've worked on quite a few superhero projects, be it the Wolverine anime, you've been in Wolverine and the X-Men, you've worked in the Arkham games, and so on. As an actor and someone who definitely sees these things as art, and you've talked about it quite a bit, what attracts people, so many people, to these things as to comic book adaptations and superhero adaptations as art now? What changed from even as much as 10 years ago to now that drew so many people to this?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that happened is that the comic book readers, the kids who are comic book readers, are now adults. And so what you'll find with a lot of franchises is that the franchise might exist when you were a kid, and then it'll go away for 20 years, and it'll come back. They sort of did that with Thundercats. They've been doing that with Transformers, right? Transformers sort of was revived as a brand new franchise. Many times what happens is these Hollywood studios smell money. They say, oh, kids watched this when they were 10 or 12. It's now 20 years later. They're 30. They would probably love to have a nostalgia trip going back to the movie theater to watch the characters they loved as a kid. They're familiar with the characters. It's going to be an easy sell. So why don't we make a film about this and bring them to the theaters? Sometimes it's that mercenary thought process at studios. Other times there's a real passion for the storytelling. I mean, I don't think that was the case with the original Christopher Reeve Superman film that I sort of grew up on. The idea then was, let's see if we can tell Superman as believably as possible to people who maybe aren't comic book fans. The recent spate of comic book stuff, though, I think has to do with the rise of the acceptance of fandom. Geek culture and fandom is now far more acceptable than it has ever been before, mostly because it wields so much economic power. You've got so many people going to Comic-Con and so many people enjoying this sort of content that there's money to be made there. And so when producers smell money, they want to make content to satisfy that demand. So that's probably the economic influence on why this stuff has become more popular recently, or many of the economic influences. But I also think there are artistic influences. I think that superheroes speak to archetypal ideas in our mind. We as human beings like fantasy and sci-fi. Many people who are of a more literary or serious bent might look down their noses at science fiction and fantasy storytelling. Well, they're sort of crazy, because the biggest selling books and the highest grossing films at the box office are all fantasy and sci-fi. Just go look it up. Go to boxofficemojo.com and look up the highest grossing films of all time, and the vast majority of them are science fiction and fantasy films, and the other ones are Disney and Pixar, which one could argue are still fantasy and sci-fi. And that's been the case historically. I mean, what is the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, except a fantasy, right? This sort of crazy adventure that he goes on. What is Dante's Inferno but a fantasy storytelling? It's only since the Victorian era that we've had this sort of snooty notion about fairy tales being only for children and fantasy storytelling being less than appropriate literature. So I think what you're seeing is that a lot of people are sick and tired of this sort of overly serious storytelling. They'd like stuff that speaks to them on a more mythological, a more epic, a more heroic level, so that they can sort of mess around with these larger metaphysical questions. Standard fiction and literature is really good at dealing with humanistic questions, right? It's really good at saying, how does this one character deal with this problem, either psychological or some life problem, right? So we might watch a story that's a very straightforward fiction movie about one person dealing with a death in their family or their own mortality, right? And we can see how that person faces death. Fantasy and sci-fi asks the question, what does it mean to die, right? So that when Pippin and Gandalf are in Minas Tirith under siege in Return of the King, and it looks like this is the end, and Gandalf says, no, there is life after death, and he starts rattling on about what the afterlife is like. Of course, it's a little bit of a misquote. He's actually talking about Valinor, but we'll let that pass. That's not really what the afterlife is like in the Middle Earth, but it's what Valinor is like. It's what the Undying Lands are like. So that's all right. But there's a discussion about that, right? What does it mean to die? What does it mean for anyone to die? What does it mean to live after death? These are the kind of questions that science fiction and fantasy, these sort of metaphysical questions, they sort of address this stuff head on in ways that sometimes modern, more realistic literature shies away from, maybe has a harder time sort of addressing. And I think people are hungry for that sort of metaphysical storytelling. You know, what does it mean to stay true to your values even when you're working within a corrupt system, also known as Captain America, the Winter Soldier, right? I mean, I really love that film because it really addressed this notion of, is it possible to stay true to your principles even when you're surrounded by people who are utterly corrupt? That's a useful thing to sort of address in one's life, and you can take that metaphor and apply it to your life in all sorts of different ways. And it isn't necessarily burdened by, well, we're going to tell the story of this one person who stood up for their principles, right? We're going to address it just as a larger metaphor for everybody. I like that kind of metaphorical, metaphysical, archetypal storytelling. I find that very compelling. It's like fairy tales about to help me through my own life. So I think that's probably the artistic reason why superhero and superhero storytelling is so compelling to so many people right now.
Okay, so this listener one, she says, I've been to some of your panels at cons, and I've heard you talk about how, as an aspiring voice actor, we should read Shakespeare, and diversify ourselves. I've noticed that you are credited for some of the songs in some of the shows or video games you've done. Do you recommend that someone who wants to be an aspiring voice actor sing as well, or at least learn to be able to do that, as I've noticed that you and Jim Cummings and others have singing credits for their IMDb?
Yes. I think singing can only help. Anything that allows you to get more control and more facility with your instrument, with your vocal instrument, is going to be incredibly helpful. And I would credit my singing training with helping me know how to use my voice correctly under stressful circumstances like screaming and whatnot, and not damage myself. Because I've got good sort of classical singing training, I'm able to do some pretty crazy stuff with my voice and not damage it, not hurt it permanently. Just like any athlete is going to be probably good if they decide to go into stunts because they understand how to handle their body physically, as opposed to someone who's maybe never done anything physical in their life before, and you start trying to make them do stunts, they might hurt themselves until they figure out what they're doing, you know. And I talk about this extensively in my podcast on voice acting. If anyone is interested, I I've been running a podcast on voice acting since, I don't know, it's over 4 years now. It's called voiceactingmastery.com. You can find it there at the website, voiceactingmastery.com, or you can find it on the iTunes podcast listing under Voice Acting Mastery or under my name, Crispin Freeman. And the website and the podcast are all about trying to explain to people what it takes to be able to work as a professional voice actor, what you need to know. And I credit my singing abilities all the time. I find it very, very useful. Now, are there voice actors who aren't singers? Absolutely. Sure, there are. But, you know, if you have the opportunity to get some classical singing training, it can only help.
Okay, last question, and then afterward I have a bumper request, if that's okay.
Okay.
So the last question we ask everyone, you've just mentioned your podcast and your website. We give all our guests the opportunity to have a soapbox to promote any upcoming appearances, any projects that's just released, any classes, anything they want to teach the fans or talk to the fans about. We give you the soapbox now to promote anything that we perhaps haven't touched on yet.
Gotcha. Well, the two biggest things that I like to talk about with fans, and this is the case when I go to conventions or any time that I'm interacting with fans, my two favorite topics are, what does it take to work as a professional in the industry, either as a voice actor or a screenwriter or a director or any sort of thing? What does it take to work as a professional in the industry? And why do we like these stories so much? What is it that's so compelling about these stories? And so I have two websites dedicated to both those topics. The first one is my Voice Acting Mastery website at voiceactingmastery.com, where I do my best to share with people through my free podcast what it truly takes to work as a professional voice actor. So you can download every episode of the podcast for free. I suggest you start at the beginning and just start listening through, because there's some really good stuff in there. My own podcast that I've created, interviews, answering questions from my listeners and whatnot. That's the one aspect. The other aspect, why we're so fascinated by the storytelling, that is what I like to call my mythology scholarship, my studies into mythology and how mythology affects pop culture storytelling. My website for that is mythologyandmeaning.com. That's the sort of online home for all of my scholarly studies into mythology. It's divided into three parts, one on animation mythology, one on film mythology, mostly live-action sci-fi and fantasy films. And then there is another section on video games, which is still under development. I'm still working on some of the research that I need to do my presentations on mythology in video game storytelling. But you can see descriptions of the panels. I have 5 panels for animation and 5 different panels for sci-fi and fantasy films. And there's a trailer on the website as well, so you can get a sense of what they look like and whatnot. I get requested to do these at conventions all the time, and film festivals and conferences and whatnot. But if you want to go check those out, please feel free to do so. If you go to crispinfreeman.com, there are also links to both those websites, so I try to make it as easy as possible to get access to all that information. And in the future, I've been running a podcast on voice acting now for over 4 years, and I'm planning on actually starting a podcast on my mythology scholarship early next year. So that's the plan for right now. The end of the year is coming quickly, and it's like letting the air out of a balloon. It's like, whoosh, we have to get everything done before the end of the year. But if I can get all my other projects done, then I am looking forward to starting up my mythology podcast early in 2016.
And if what you've been saying today is just a hint of what some of the stuff we could hear, I will be tuning into that one.
Oh, well, thank you.
For sure. Okay, so my bumper request, one is so I can put it on this week's episode to say next week, this is what's happening. Could you record something along the lines of, we'll say Alucard's voice, because that'll work well for Halloween, something along the lines of, hello, listeners, this is Alucard, and next week on Bombard Radio, you can listen to me, yes, me, Alucard, on Bombard Radio, or something along that lines.
Sure, although if we say that you can listen to me, Alucard, and I never really did any Alucard during the show, isn't that misleading?
Oh, you can say, this is Alucard, and you can listen to...
An interview with Crispin Freeman in next week's episode?
An interview with Crispin Freeman next week's episode.
Of the Bombard Radio. Okay.
Yeah, of Bombard Radio.
All right, are you ready?
Yes.
Greetings. This is Alucard. I am but a servant of the Helsing organization. Tune in next week to Bombard Radio, where you will get to hear an interview with the voice actor who plays me, Crispin Freeman, that undead maggot. So make sure to tune in and enjoy next week's episode.
That was awesome. And the other one, this is just one that we can continue promoting the episode as we go in the future, because we like these to be mostly timeless. Any voice you want, some along the lines of, or even just be your normal voice. Oh, this is Crispin Freeman, voice of insert characters here, and you're listening to Bombad Radio.
Sure. Hi, this is Crispin Freeman. I'm the voice actor for characters like Alucard in Hellsing, Winston in Blizzard's Overwatch video game, and Red Arrow in Young Justice. And you're listening to Bombad Radio.